Hey everyone and welcome back. We're diving into something pretty cool today. It's object permanence and autism. So, like when a baby completely freaks out when you hide their favorite toy?
Yeah.
That's because they don't really get object permanence yet. They actually think like, poof, it's gone.
Yeah.
It's wild, right?
Uh-huh.
But for some people on the autism spectrum, this idea can be a little tricky even after those baby years. And so that's what we're going to explore today, why that is and what kind of support can help. And we're using this article from Cheap ABA. It's called Autism and Object Permanence, Understanding and Supporting Spatial Awareness. I really like that this website is all about affordable resources because, navigating support for autism can be expensive.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what's the deal with object permanence and autism?
So it really comes down to the fact that we all think and perceive the world a little bit differently. And while most people develop that solid understanding of object permanence pretty early on, it can be a different journey for autistic individuals.
Oh.
And there are a few key factors that contribute to that.
Okay, well, let's unpack those factors. The article mentions sensory processing differences. And I know that's a big topic in the autism community.
It is. Sensory processing is essentially how our brains take in information from the world around us. Sights, sounds, textures, all of it. For some autistic individuals, these sensory signals can be processed differently. Imagine trying to focus on a hidden object while you're also completely overwhelmed by the sounds and textures in the environment.
Wow, yeah, I never thought of it that way. It's like trying to find your keys when there are flashing lights and sirens going off everywhere. No wonder object permanence can be a challenge.
That's a great analogy. And then on top of that, there's also the factor of executive functioning, which is basically your brain's management system. It helps us plan, organize our thoughts, and solve problems. If there are any challenges in this area, it can impact how someone understands and interacts with object permanence.
So even if you, logically know that something still exists, if your brain is having a hard time organizing all the information it's getting, remembering where you saw it last could be super difficult.
Exactly. It's like trying to find a specific file on a computer desktop that's super cluttered. You know the file is there, but it's buried under a mountain of other stuff. And then finally, we have differences in spatial awareness, which is our ability to understand where we are in relation to objects and how those objects relate to each other.
So, being able to picture in your mind where the couch is compared to the TV, even if you're not looking right at them.
Exactly. And for some autistic individuals, this processing can be different, which can make it tricky to grasp that an object out of sight still takes up space in the world. It's almost like having a slightly different internal map of their environment.
Okay, so we've got these three things: sensory processing, executive functioning, and spatial awareness. They could all play a role in how object permanence is experienced. But the good news is that Cheap ABA doesn't just talk about the challenges. They offer some really practical strategies for support, too. I'm excited to get into those. What's first?
Well, they start with something that I think we can all agree is awesome: play-based learning.
I was hoping they'd say that. Play is the best way to learn no matter how old you are.
Yeah, for sure. And when it comes to object permanence, games like hide and seek can be so powerful. You hide, the child seeks, and then all of a sudden they understand that you still exist even when they can't see you.
Yeah. It's like the brain is making those connections in real time. Bet those moments are pure magic. What other kinds of play can help?
Oh, there are tons. Peekaboo for little ones, putting toys into containers and taking them out, even building a fort and then disappearing inside it. All of these things reinforce that things and people don't just disappear into thin air.
I love that. It's taking these concepts and putting them into everyday activities. Speaking of everyday activities, the article also mentions visual aids. So how do those work?
Visual aids are great for making these abstract ideas out of sight but still exist more concrete. The article mentions using pictures and videos, so you could show a picture of a toy and then hide the toy, and then you can refer back to the photo to remind the child that it's still there, just hidden.
It's like a visual anchor for the concept.
Exactly. And videos can be even better because they actually show the object disappearing and reappearing, really hammering home that idea that things continue to exist.
Okay, so we've got play and visual aids. What else?
Next is something that might sound a little more complex, but it's really about making a supportive environment for their senses. Sensory integration techniques.
Okay, break this down for me. What are we talking about here?
Sensory integration techniques are activities that provide specific kinds of sensory input, and they can be really helpful for people with autism who process those signals differently.
Can you give me some examples from the article?
Yeah, absolutely. Cheap ABA mentions deep pressure activities like weighted blankets or firm hugs. Those can be really calming and regulating. And they also talk about joint compression, which you can get by like pushing heavy objects or getting a firm massage.
Okay, I'm with you so far. But how do these connect back to object permanence?
By helping to regulate sensory input, these techniques can improve focus and attention, which we talked about earlier as being really important for understanding object permanence. It's all about making a more balanced experience so they can process and understand the world better.
Like clearing away the clutter in their mind to make room to learn.
Exactly. And on that note, there's one more powerful tool that can help support spatial awareness and object permanence: assistive technology.
Ooh, that sounds interesting. I think we'll save that for part 2 of our deep dive. Don't go anywhere, folks. We'll be right back. All right, we're back. Before the break, we were talking about sensory integration techniques and how those can help create a more balanced sensory experience, especially for people on the autism spectrum, which can totally change the game when it comes to understanding object permanence. Now, I'm really interested to hear more about this assistive technology thing you mentioned. What kind of tech are we talking about here, and how does this all work?
This is where things get really cool. The Cheap ABA article specifically talks about visual schedules and GPS devices as a couple of examples, and they can be super powerful tools.
Okay, so visual schedules first. I get how those would be helpful just in general, but how do they actually relate to object permanence?
Well, think about it like this. For a lot of autistic people, predictability and structure can be like super calming and reassuring. Visual schedules kind of give them that clear roadmap of what to expect, which in turn reduces their anxiety and helps them focus better.
So instead of feeling overwhelmed by the unexpected, they can approach things knowing what's coming next. Makes sense.
Exactly. And when you apply that to object permanence, it can be really helpful. Like, let's say the schedule has a step for putting away toys. The person sees a picture of the toy going into its container. So they're not only reminded about the routine, but also reminded that the toy is still there even when it's in the bin.
It's like a visual for out of sight but still exists, right?
Right.
And that ties back to the whole spatial awareness thing we were talking about, knowing where things are in the world even when you can't see them.
Totally. And when it comes to spatial awareness, that's where those GPS devices come in. I mean, obviously they're great for getting from point A to point B, but they can do way more than that.
Hey, I'm listening.
Uh,
How does using a GPS connect to object permanence? Seems like a bit of a stretch.
it might seem that way, but when you kind of zoom out and look at the bigger picture, it makes a lot of sense. Imagine the stress and anxiety that can come with being in a place you don't know, especially if you have some challenges with spatial awareness. A GPS can really help with that stress and boost confidence, which frees up their mental energy to focus on other things, including understanding object permanence.
That's really interesting. So it's less about the tech itself and more about the way it impacts well-being and cognitive resources. By reducing stress and making the world feel a little more manageable, you can actually indirectly help with object permanence.
Exactly. It really shows how all of these different things are connected, sensory processing, executive functioning, spatial awareness, even tech. They all play a role in how we experience and understand the world.
It's definitely a holistic perspective. And I like how the Cheap ABA article really emphasizes that. Now, before we move on, I want to take a second to ask our listeners something. Think about everything we've been talking about with object permanence and the challenges some autistic people might face. How do you think those challenges would impact their everyday life? What kind of situations might be particularly difficult?
That's a great question. It's important to remember that every autistic person's experience is going to be different, but generally speaking, difficulties with object permanence could make things like switching between activities harder, or even finding lost things, which honestly can be frustrating for anyone. But even more so if you're struggling with this concept.
Yeah, it's like having a different set of tools for navigating the world. And those tools might work great sometimes, but other times they might create challenges.
Exactly. And that just shows how important it is to understand and support those differences. Instead of trying to force everyone to use the same tools.
Absolutely. Now, the article outlines some really helpful strategies, but I'm wondering, what else could we add to that toolbox? What other ideas come to mind when you think about supporting object permanence in everyday life?
I'm glad you asked. I think one thing that stands out is using activities that really engage the senses as part of their daily routines. Things like playing with textured toys, or exploring different smells, or even listening to calming music.
So it's about giving them lots of different sensory experiences to help with that sensory integration process we talked about before. I like it.
For sure. And on a similar note, I think it's so important to pay attention to the language we use when we talk to autistic people, especially when we're explaining something like object permanence, like avoiding idioms or figures of speech can help a lot, because they might take those literally.
That's a good point. Clear and simple language is so important,
Yeah.
especially when you're dealing with abstract ideas.
Absolutely. And the last thing I'll say is that patience and understanding are key. Learning takes time, and everyone goes at their own pace. So celebrating those small victories and focusing on progress instead of perfection can really help create that supportive environment.
That's a great point to end on and a perfect note to transition to the final part of our deep dive. Stay with us, folks. We'll be right back. Okay, so we're back for the last part of our look at object permanence and autism. It's been a really interesting conversation, and I feel like I've learned a lot.
Yeah, me too. We've covered a lot, like all those different
Yeah.
factors that can make object permanence a challenge and all those different ways to help and support people.
Yeah, and I think one of the big things I'm taking away from this is just how important it is to be understanding and have empathy. Object permanence is something so many of us just take for granted, but for people on the autism spectrum, it can be totally different.
It really shows how different we all are when it comes to how we see and understand the world. And that's a good thing. It's something to celebrate.
Absolutely. Now, before we finish up, I want to go back to something the cheap ABA article talked about, and that is that object permanence isn't just a thing babies deal with. It can affect autistic individuals throughout their lives.
Yeah, that's super important. And it means we need to keep supporting and understanding them.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with this thought. It's kind of amazing how this simple idea that things still exist even when you can't see them can really change how we experience the world.
It makes you really think about how complex our brains are, huh? And it shows how important it is to keep learning and understanding each other and embrace all the different ways people experience life.
Yeah, totally. And for anyone who wants to learn more about all this, definitely go check out that cheap ABA website. They have tons of great info and resources. All right, everyone, that's it for this deep dive. See you next time.